Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.
Today we'll be talking about EU action against human trafficking, a serious crime and lucrative business that knows no borders and continues to draw too many victims in Europe and all over the world, especially women and children.
Trafficking in human beings is a grave violation of fundamental rights recognised by the international community and prohibited by the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. And yet it happens in every country and every region, and the EU is no exception.
Although it's not a new phenomenon, it has taken a whole new dimension with globalisation and the rise of the internet. But partly because of its invisible nature, it's extremely difficult to give precise figures on the real number of victims or the associated economic and social costs.
There are, however, some chilling figures. In one single year from 2017 to 2018, more than 14,000 victims of human trafficking were identified in the EU, 72% of them women and girls, trafficked mostly for sexual exploitation, and children are increasingly falling prey to traffickers.
But the real number of victims could be 5, 10, even 20 times higher.
Indeed, according to the International Labour Organization, between 2012 and 2016, around 89 million persons globally experienced some form of exploitation. Some were forced into the sex industry, others were victims of forced labour or forced marriage, and roughly a quarter of them were children.
And whether we look at the EU or elsewhere, one thing is clear. The vast majority of victims are women, and increasingly children. Pascal Renke-Schreiber from the Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling section of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime has the latest figures.
The most recent UNODC Global Report on Trafficking in Persons found that most detected victims, around 65%, are still women and girls, most of them exploited in sexual exploitation. However, the share of detected male victims has steadily increased over the years, with the share of boys among detected trafficking victims having increased 5 times in the past 15 years.
And the majority of victims, 65% in the countries of Western and Southern Europe, are migrants who are trafficked inside their own countries. Peter Bukowski is a policy expert at the European Parliamentary Research Service.
Human trafficking happens largely within the EU borders. Nearly half of the victims are EU nationals, and many of them are in fact trafficked within their own member state. Traditional flow from Eastern to Western Europe has been replaced by diverse flows from all over the EU. For non-EU victims, Nigeria remains the main country of origin.
Now, which are the most common forms of exploitation?
Topping the list is trafficking for sexual exploitation, which claims half of the victims both worldwide and at EU level. This is a severe form of violence against women and is deeply rooted in gender inequalities.
But trafficking for labour exploitation is on the rise, and in some European countries such as Belgium, Portugal or Cyprus, it's already the main form of exploitation.
This form of modern-day slavery tends to concentrate on sectors such as construction, agriculture, food processing or domestic work, which feed on the thousands of irregular migrants that, with no recourse to protection, are easy prey for organised criminal groups.
These groups traffic victims to force them into criminal activities, into begging or to remove their organs and sell them to the highest bidder.
Criminals exploit vulnerable people, making high profits with relatively low risks. And vulnerability can result from a whole range of factors, including socio-economic ones, such as poverty, lack of education, conflict and violence. And migrants are a particularly vulnerable group.
They are, actually. What often begins as migrant smuggling may quickly become a trafficking situation, with victims paying to be smuggled into a country only to discover that they've been deceived into exploitation and have no means nor choice to do otherwise.
But one thing is clear, without demand, there's no supply. In other words, without people ready to exploit others, there wouldn't be a need for this podcast. And this is particularly true in the cases of sexual and labour exploitation.
And the pandemic just made things worse.
Indeed, the pandemic has created new risks for victims and opportunities for traffickers. It has exacerbated socioeconomic problems which are the root causes of trafficking. It has also accelerated the trend of criminal activities going online. Modern technologies are now used at all stages of trafficking, from recruitment to the control over victims by means such as blackmail, for instance by using threats of sharing recordings of sexual acts online.
So, what is the EU doing to prevent and combat human trafficking? Stay with us.
In April 2021, 10 years after the adoption of the Anti-Trafficking Directive, which is the main EU instrument addressing this phenomenon and protecting its victims, the EU presented its new strategy on combating trafficking in human beings.
The new strategy aims at better preventing trafficking, breaking the business model of criminals, bringing traffickers to justice, and, as the European Commissioner for Home Affairs, Ylva Johansson, stresses, better protecting and empowering victims.
We need to protect the victims much better. And this is actually the area where we can see many member states have not implemented the current directive properly to give the proper support to victims. We need more education. We need more awareness. This is a very low-risk, high-profit crime. I would like to turn it into a high-risk, low-profit crime.
In its efforts to eradicate human trafficking, the EU has not only created a solid legal framework, it has also put in place an operational cooperation network involving EU agencies such as Europol, Eurojust, CEPOL and Frontex to fight human trafficking together and more effectively.
Moreover, trafficking in human beings is a priority of the EU policy cycle for organised and serious international crime. Thanks to these joint efforts, in 2020, 5,214 victims of human trafficking and online child pornography were identified in the EU, and 67 organised crime groups dismantled. But the fight is far from over.
With demand for exploitation expected to continue, traffickers moving their acts online and the pandemic likely to create the conditions for increased exploitation, the new EU strategy should allow the EU and its member states to continue strengthening their response.
And, according to Pascal Reinke-Schreiber from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, beef up international efforts against this crime.
The new EU strategy on combating trafficking in human beings is another global puzzle piece to strengthen the international response to trafficking in persons. It is essential to promote and spell out gender and age-responsive approaches in order to support and protect victims of all genders and ages.
And here the European Parliament also plays a major role, not only in designing policies, but also in evaluating their implementation.
So, if you want to find out more information on this topic, read the full brief by Peter Bukowski and Sofia Voronova on the EPRS website.
This is a European Parliamentary Research Service podcast.
Thanks for listening.